I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Many of us have those stubborn pounds that seem impossible to lose, no matter how good we eat or how hard we work out. My solution is PlushCare. PlushCare is a leading telehealth provider with doctors who are there for you day and night to partner with you in your weight loss journey. They can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Plus, they accept most insurance plans. To get started, visit plushcare.com/weightloss. That's plushcare.com/weightloss.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonicist. Today we're trying something really quite different. Earlier this month I did a piece on Napoleon, how he's remembered, and offered some of my own thoughts on the unending sort of good guy, bad guy debate that rages on social media. But that's just my opinion, and I think it's important for us to have a reasonable discussion. So I'm joined by two individuals at opposite ends of the Napoleon fan spectrum. I'm joined by Marcus Cribb, a regular Napoleonic commentator on the podcast History Hack and manager of Apsley House, which pretty much means that disliking Napoleon is an essential part of his day job. For the pro-Napoleon camp, I have Luke Daly Groves, who is best known for waging a one-man war against the Hitler fled to Argentina after World War II nutters, and does a sterling job in the process. But he's also a specialist on the legacy of Napoleon and on the memory of the emperor, both in France and the UK. It's great to have you both on, gents. How are you doing?
Thanks very much. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting us on. Nice to meet both of you.
You too. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this.
Now, this being a debate, the first thing to get out there is that I am going to be completely unbiased. I've had my say. People can have a listen to that if they want to. This is about two knowledgeable people having a reasonable discussion about Napoleon and showing to those on social media that you can actually get much further in historical debate by talking rather than screaming Napoleon's pro and anti-Napoleon propaganda at each other. So we're going to start with both of you taking a couple of minutes to state your cases. What's your perspective on Napoleon, and how did you as individuals arrive at your conclusions? Luke, start us off.
So Napoleon Bonaparte to me is a truly remarkable and inspirational man. It's really difficult to sort of try and summarize this sort of giant of history in a short introduction, but his story is one of endless fascination. The fact that he rises from relative obscurity in Corsica to become Emperor of the French, largely by his own merit. It's one of hope. It's one of the idea that you can achieve almost anything if you work hard and you really sort of put your mind to things. And I must say that I appreciate the man more than the legend, or despite of the legend and despite the myths that surround him, because I don't think he needs it. I think he's incredible even without that sort of myth making and sort of legend which surrounds him. So you asked how I arrived at these conclusions. Well, I sort of studied Napoleon's system of rule at undergraduate level, and I thought that he was unfairly maligned by some popular perceptions and some sort of dark myths. And then for my MA research, my master's research, I studied the Napoleonic legend in Britain. And it's really interesting that sort of Marcus, right from the get-go there, identifies a sort of pro-British camp as being anti-Napoleon, because what I found from my sort of primary source research into popular perceptions of both Napoleons in the 19th century is that there is a large amount of support for Napoleon in Britain during his rule, and particularly afterwards. And I would be hesitant to sort of identify that as a sort of anti-British thing. And so to sort of round it off, I think that my thinking on Napoleon is quite well summarized by one of his most recent biographers, which is Michael Breurs, a professor of Western European history at Oxford, and he's written Napoleon, Soldier of Destiny. And he says that his mental and physical energy, his unique talents, the sum of which can rightly be called genius, set him apart from ordinary people. And I'm inclined to agree with that. I think the man was a genius. So that's where I stand. Largely positive perception, but not blind to the faults.
But nicely put, I thought. Marcus, I'm going to come straight to you. We'll do rebuttals in a moment, but just give us your stance on Napoleon first.
So I came to Napoleon actually in A-level. We did the end of the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon. And I came to him actually quite admiring a man. You see the chaos of the French Revolution, especially during the terror that came out of that. And then you see someone who, it seems, is bringing peace and stability to France. And I really admired that. It wasn't until really I had quite a career in museums spanning from tanks to Victorian ships and everything in between, but really diving into the Peninsular War and finding an area that I love and admire, and it's so interesting in so many different areas. And finding the first-hand accounts then of the French and the atrocities they committed in Spain and Portugal, which I'll definitely come back onto later, made me start to think there was quite a darker side to this. Then when I kind of reading Napoleon's rise, kind of removing my adoration and rose-tinted glasses, you see the rise, which has been played out time and time again, of a dictator coming in from chaos, assuming power, putting himself into a position of opportunity, moving his inner circle in and up with him. And then whether he declared war was declared him, wars raging across Europe that caused millions and millions of deaths. I will admit that he has positives, ones which you've covered in your podcast and we'll definitely cover today, on his reforms and his ways of raging war and his legacy. But the more I've seen his legacy, these T-shirts with his face on it and postcards and buttonholes and so much more, it really turns me off. It's like we've said before, a cult-like, almost. He's revered near like Herculean powers by some, not Luke, I know, but he's held so high that I think actually in this demigod status that I think it's worrying that people are blind to the history and the facts. And therefore, as people that know me, especially, I will take the counter argument to try to highlight his flaws more than I actually possibly believe, because I think that these flaws and especially these atrocities and crimes need to be highlighted in history, as we cannot ignore them for the people that suffered. I think it's important to remember them.
I think the world is going to be kind of astounded by this reasonable stance that's just come out of Marcus Cribb's mouth. He's known for a good Napoleon meme. So, sorry, Luke, you carry on.
I would actually largely agree with Marcus there, because I think a lot of this sort of propaganda that you see now, his face on T-shirts and all this, which I will admit to having engaged in at some point or other, is in a large respect, it's commemorating a legend, not the actual man. So it's more about what people want Napoleon to have been and want to think of Napoleon, their own sort of personal identification with his sort of broader ideas, rather than, as Marcus rightly points out, the darker things that his rule actually meant in actuality and what he actually did during his time. So yeah, I would largely actually agree with that, and I think that's fair enough. But where I would slightly digress is that I think if you leave the legend aside, I think the man is sort of commendable enough on his own merits, rather than sort of even taking into consideration his dark sides. I think he still. It
is difficult with the legend and the cult Napoleon, which he created but persists today. I mean, you've obviously got the painting of the two paintings of him crossing the Alps, one on a mule and one on a grey or white stallion, And that's how he's remembered. And then his coronation and him sat there on the throne with his robes. It's almost like sun rays coming out of his laurel wreath crown. And that's where some people see him today. And I think it's just too high a pedestal to put anyone on. And it just kind of, you forget that who he's trampled to be there, what's underneath that throne, that robes. And I think that's where we're gonna dive a bit deeper into.
Yeah, no, I literally, I can't disagree with that. I don't agree with hero worship. I think you should admire people's individual actions, rather than just an entire being as this sort of godlike thing. Yeah, I would agree with that. This is interesting.
I wasn't expecting this level of agreement, but let's plow on and drill down into some specifics now. And let's begin with his achievements. Luke, the Code Napoleon, widely referred to as one of his greatest legacies. It is an impressive document, and it was certainly something that France sorely needed. What are your thoughts on its significance?
I think, firstly, to start off, is that the Code Napoleon is a sort of, it's an endpoint of brilliant achievements which Napoleon himself has sort of headed in administration and organization in his earlier campaigns. So if you look at what he does in the Italian campaign, what he does in Egypt, is that in Malta, he's this, I mean, some historians have said he deserves to be remembered more as a statesman than even as a military, as a soldier, which is the angle that I sort of come at it, because nothing, if you look at his correspondence, nothing is too small for Napoleon's mind. So he's organizing police systems, small departments, ministries. I think in Egypt he even goes as far as organizing street cleaning. His mind is operating in all these different ways, and he just he's a remarkable administrator and occupier of countries. So he's not just a soldier. He gets there and he mixes everything up in terms of how the whole country is run. And then you have, of course, when he becomes first consul and then emperor, it changes to Code Napoleon from the civil code. But then you have this codification, this as you say, this huge document which you can actually see if you go to Milan in the Museum of Italian Reunification. You can see a copy of it, an original copy. It is a compromise, which is funny because you probably don't associate that word with Napoleon very much, but it's a compromise between the Ancien regime and the French Revolution. It mixes it, or at least it tries to mix the best parts of both. So it sort of takes ideas from the revolutionary period and sort of gives them an Ancien regime garb in some ways. And this is how Napoleon's reign is probably favorably known as well, that he's the sort of synthesis of the revolution and of the old order as well. And of course, the positive aspects of the code are that, it gives French peasants the sort of security to maintain the property which they gained from the revolution in one of its articles, which is incredibly popular at the time. And the sort of the basis of lawmaking that it establishes, you can trace the legacy of that to many countries around the world today, particularly in France, but across Europe as well, and even further afield. The Code Napoleon is a foundation of modern lawmaking today. And I think there's an interesting quote which I've picked out to sort of, which I sort of think of when I think of Napoleon, not just the code, but as an administrator, an organizer, a bureaucrat. And it's from Eric Hobsbawm, who you might not think to be sort of favorable to Napoleon because he comes at things from a Marxist perspective. But he says that no doubt the British saw themselves fighting for liberty against tyranny, but in 1815, most Englishmen were probably poorer and worse off than they had been in 1800, whilst most Frenchmen were certainly better off. And it's this idea that the code brings much needed stability after the sort of chaos of the coups and counter-coups of the Directory and the French Revolutionary Terror period. And this actually, with stability, brings prosperity. And I think if you look at the socio-economic conditions at the time, that his system of rule in France certainly compares favorably to his opponents. That's how I put it.
That's fair enough. I mean, I'm interested by the Hobsbawm quote because I wonder to what extent is the reduced prosperity for the British public at the end of the Napoleonic Wars a direct result of nearly 25 years of continuous conflict. But it's unfair of me to critique Hobsbawm and to kind of ask you to comment on that, unless you particularly want to.
Well, Napoleon's at war as well. I mean, he's committing hundreds of thousands of men to war as well. So, you know, and I think Britain does rather better in terms of defying his sort of continental blockade. So I don't think that's necessarily the case with the comparison. I think the system which Napoleon established in France was more liberal than the system that was operating in Britain at the time, and certainly in terms of politics. Of course, we can get into that later, but I do think that Napoleon has much to do with that stability and that comparative prosperity.
What about the negatives in there, though? And I'm thinking particularly here about women's rights, slavery, where there were steps back from the gains that had been made during the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, this is the idea of it being a compromise, and you know, Napoleon's views on women are rightly considered to be very backwards today, but at the time they were very common, they were very traditional, and there is evidence that they were actually popular as well. Obviously not with a lot of women, but with the men who sort of have Napoleon's support. And again, if you compare it to, you know, his main opponents in Britain, you know, the Great Reform Act, which comes well after the Napoleonic Wars, establishes that women can't vote at the time then. So it's not really unusual for the time, but it is, as you rightly say, a step backwards. And of course, slavery is abhorrent, and we know it's abhorrent. But then, you know, Napoleon's opponents, Britain, you know, of course, it abolishes the slave trade or slavery in the middle of Napoleon's rule. But again, you know, for half of Napoleon's rule, Britain also has slavery. And it's the case with his opponents as well. You know, you've got serfdom in Tsarist Russia. So again, yes, there are bad things about the Code Napoleon and things that we wouldn't wish to see repeated today. But in terms of the advancements and the stability that it brings, I think overall it can be seen as a positive step forwards, taking into account the necessary compromises, which did take some things backwards.
Marcus, what's your thinking on the code?
So the code's a really interesting one, isn't it? So straight from the get-go, it's not the Code Napoleon. We're straight in with Napoleon propaganda. It's the Code Civil des Français. It's not the Code Napoleon. It's this legend that he's written it himself. There's all these stories that he spent 20 hours a day working by candlelight writing the Code Napoleon, when actually he probably just rubber stamped most of the thing. It was written by Jean-Jacques Regis, the Duc de Parme. Sorry for any pronunciation I've got wrong there. He's written it with a team of lawyers. And it's a great document. It's one that needed to be written, but it wasn't written by Napoleon. He is taking credit for other people's work under his administration. And it has huge flaws. Luke's already admitted it's the slavery of the women's rights. It's also, it's got a quite reversal of quite a few employment rights that have come in through the revolution, and it upholds the class system, making it deeply unrevolutionary. There's this idea, and I won't even just say it, you know, it's Andrew Roberts, of that Napoleon is basically the revolution on horseback going forwards. It's just not the case. The Code Napoleon reverses, and this is the big thing. Women's rights massively increased during the French Revolution, which I think we can all agree was a good thing, despite the terrors of the French Revolution. Women's rights really increased. Napoleon reverses that and removes a lot of women's rights. So they effectively become property again. A huge step backwards, removing it hundreds of years backwards. The other one is Napoleon isn't just apathetical to slavery. Slavery gets abolished under the revolution. He brings it back in and then deeply entrenches it, enforces it into French overseas territories. This isn't a passive idea, and it's often held up, Napoleon abolishes slavery in 1815 when he comes back, but he didn't really have much time to do anything, and we don't know if he'd won actually if he would have reintroduced it, because he would have needed it. It's the strong reversal of civil liberties and rights, and something we're going to come on to, I know, is the kind of the police state as well. But the Code Napoleon isn't progressive, it isn't Napoleon, and it does have a long legacy, but a bit like the American amendment systems, it's been hugely edited. It's got the foundations, but these foundations have had now new titanium rods put into the ground to actually support the civil structures that are in place today. and not all of Europe uses it. It's widely spread into Italy and former French areas, but not all across. And Britain had a different system. We didn't have an outright, revolution, and these things came slowly, gently, and we've ended up in very similar places at the end of the day with quite liberal democracies. So it wasn't necessary that Napoleon was needed to write these documents, and he didn't anyway.
But I think it's unfair to sort of dissociate Napoleon completely from the code. He presides over 55 out of 106 meetings about the code. And it's noted that, it was his interest in the drafting of the code and his motivation and his humor, which actually spurred on the legislators in sort of creating this document. And, the idea that, it wasn't Napoleon's doing, it's not the Code Napoleon. Well, that goes against the idea of him being a dictator. Surely a dictator would say, I want all of this. This is my code. Well, no, actually, he listened to the Council of State and he was willing to learn from them and to sort of, he understood that they were experts and he would allow them to sort of guide the debate in that way. I understand what you say, that he takes more credit for it than he should. And that's something that Napoleon, was one of his faults, which I would pick out about him, is that he's got this great habit of taking things that other people do and say that he did them. But I don't think it's the mark particularly of a dictator, the fact that he presides over just over half of the meetings concerning the code. So he's obviously got an interest in it and he's there, but he's not overbearing. He doesn't have to be there all the time. He's not saying you must do this, you must do that. He's sort of spurring it on. And you say that it's yes, you're right to point out slavery and the reversal of women's rights. And I think on the case of women's rights, you'll find no defense from me other than the sort of comparison to others at the time. I think, the other things which Napoleon does, he makes education more accessible. The education under the Directory was widely considered to have been sort of in decline and failing. He expands the education system with the code. I mean, that's another positive thing which we haven't discussed. So I think you can't divorce Napoleon from the code, and you rightly say it provides foundations and it's heavily edited, but it's the skeletal structure of many modern bureaucracies. The titles, even the prefect system of local government, you can trace that back to Napoleon in France. So I think it's sort of unfair to see it as a counter-revolutionary document. I think it's more fair to see it as a synthesis and a compromise between both.
One thing I'd put back is I wasn't yet calling him a dictator. Definitely diving into that. But Jean-Jacques Duc de Parme, who wrote it, is meant to be the second consul. So in theory, after a year, he's meant to be stepping in. And that just never happens, which is one of the reasons that it's worth mentioning him, because he stays as second consul and then gets Chamberlain kind of positions. The other thing is, I feel that the reason that it's so successful and the reason that Napoleon and the others wanted it, and the education and everything that comes with it, is it forms the basis of Napoleon's system, which is to raise taxes and to raise men for war. And having a unified system helps conscription. And conscription was the thing which was really unpopular in France at the time. It caused such widespread devastation, but it was made all the easier by having a unified system, because I think before there was at least 3 major ones and a whole load of provisional ones under the Ancien regime, which was just madness. The fact that North France and South France didn't even have the same laws as Paris, and some really local differences. And that didn't work. But that doesn't mean that it was all honourable and there wasn't a motivation underneath. And I feel that motivation was largely this kind of total war setting that Napoleon was cranking towards.
Well, let's build on that, actually, because one of the things that often becomes a point of contention when discussing Napoleon is his politics. He came to power, as you said already, Marcus, in a coup, installed himself as an authoritarian leader of government, made use of a secret police, in so many respects also acting like a monarch of the period, though. And that's an important distinction to make, that the differences aren't huge between what Napoleon does and what other authoritarian leaders were doing across the continent at the time. So what do you make of his politics and actions as a leader of a nation?
So that's kind of the point, is he's held up as being greater Napoleon the Great and this great revolutionary liberal leader. And he's not. He is very similar to other monarchs. I was listening last night, this morning, to a series Andrew Roberts does, and he is the great supporter. And he said that there's no criticism censored of Napoleon. Well, that's not true, because I've been listening to the Napoleonicist podcast, which is much better than Andrew Roberts. And on there, we've had the theatre under the Napoleonic era, and there was censorship. There was literally police in the theatres criticising and censoring what could and could not be in that era. So censorship was there in France. 18,000 gendarmes, which is a huge amount of internal policing. That is not including the secret police. The secret police and the gendarmes had the power to detain indefinitely without trial. This was used over 2,500 times of detaining political prisoners without trial, just on their suspicion of having anti-Napoleon or anti-regime feelings of Napoleon's regime, that is. And this leads to a huge area of state surveillance, and the feeling that within France especially, that their people are being watched, their feelings and their thoughts are being policed. Passports are needed for travelling between areas, especially into new countries. And these aren't passports just as we see them today. These are permissions, like a chit to travel, basically, and to move around areas, to try to limit outside influence. Heavy searches, not just on the border, but internal checkpoints between areas to try to find dissidents. And Napoleon himself had a really heavy hand in this. He wasn't passive in any sense. He read a daily briefing from the Ministry of the General Police, which was normally like a 20-page document. And he took great personal interest in these political prisoners, deciding whether they were allowed parole, meal allowances, and where they were going. So Napoleon was very aware of the fact that he was repressing people within inside his nation, and he found it interesting, fascinating. He was, known to be a man who worked really hard, but I find it very interesting that he's a man who's also throwing himself into the political repression of his citizens.
Andrew Roberts fans are going to be baying for your blood after that comment about the Napoleonicist and how it stacks up against Napoleon the Great. But I want to throw it over to Luke. What's your take on all of this?
Well, I have not heard Roberts say that about censorship, because of course it's untrue, and I quite like Andrew Roberts as a historian. I'm not going to defend that comment. Of course Napoleon had censorship. Of course most historians agree that it's fair to classify Napoleonic France as a police state because of the way it operated, as you rightly say, with Fouché's spies and all this sort of thing, and the imprisonment without trial, etc., etc. But there are a few things I could say to what Marcus said there. I think it's notable that death penalties overall fell under Napoleon's rule, and in comparison with his key opponent Britain as well, which at that time was under the Bloody Code, there was less death penalties under Napoleon than there was in Britain at the time during Napoleon's rule. I think that there's little of what Napoleon's critics accuse him of that couldn't be used as an example against themselves as well as his opponents' regimes. I think Napoleon's, all sort of regimes have to sort of suppress conspiracy and this sort of thing. I do think Napoleon's regime went a bit too far. I mean, and certainly by modern standards, nobody's going to defend a police state as something that we would want today. But I think Napoleonic France was better in terms of terror, if you like, than what came before, and regimes that even came after as well. So Philip Dwyer, who's a Napoleonic historian who I quite admire, and I think he strikes a balance quite well in that he's not overly favourable to Napoleon, but then at the same time he can see the other side. And he quotes here from his book Napoleon and Europe, which I think is quite good. He says, all things considered, a few hundred political prisoners and a few thousand internal exiles in an empire of 30 millions was hardly excessive in comparison to the far more severe repression of which France had experienced in the 1790s during the French Revolution. And then he says, of course, the victims of Napoleon's political police undoubtedly had a somewhat different view of things. But then he goes on to say later that terror was never a tool of Napoleonic government. Terror in the sense of, the mass guillotine in which they saw in the French Revolution. And again, when you look at again, the death sentences are falling, and then you have to look at the sort of the role of others in Napoleon's regime as well. You have to look at Talleyrand and Fouché. That there is evidence. I mean, the historian Felix Markham sort of, and I think to an extent Volok as well. They sort of emphasise that Talleyrand and Fouché are egging Napoleon on in some ways, and they later try and sort of distance themselves from the execution of the Duc d'Orléans and the sort of expulsion of Jacobins and all this sort of thing. But there is a sense of it's not just Napoleon, like you said before. So if you're going to say that the civil codes or the Code Napoleon is not just Napoleon, well, you have to accept that the terror is others as well. Also, the repressive side of the regime is not just Napoleon. There are others within the system of government that are agreeing with these moves and, in fact, inspiring them as well. I do think, on a whole, to sort of summarize, I think considering the regimes of the time and the tools which Napoleon had at his disposal, he could have been far worse than he was. And I think that he showed mercy more than he had to. And as I said, he could have been worse, but he wasn't. I think he was naturally inclined to be kinder than other rulers of the period.
So that's the problem with Napoleon. He's not a terrible dictator, is often where it kind of comes down to. He has a police state, and yes, Talleyrand and people kind of are egging him on, but he has the ability there, and he certainly does use it. Like I say, he's taking real personal interest in the daily police dispatches, like 20-page documents that go straight to his front door, and he reads them almost every day, even when on campaign. He's not siding that on to someone else. He wants to see what's going on in the internal politics. And I'll admit, Britain's trying to bring him down. And there are internal problems that he needs to be worried about, effectively spies going in. But I still think that's with good reason. He is still a destabilizing agent within Europe. He's a threat to what I will admit is the old structure, the old government. And Britain is far from perfect. And we've used it as comparison a few times. In fact, it's pretty terrible, Britain. But it is, as Zach said earlier, suffering because it's at war with France. I was doing some rough maths recently and realized that people who were fighting at Waterloo would have basically been born into revolutionary war with France and in that era. And so they could have fought and died and been brought up, and all of their life and system would have been war against France, and especially Napoleon is the peak of that. I don't believe he ever really wants to sue for peace. His peace always seems quite secondary, and when he's offered good chances with huge concessions in 1812 and 1814, he throws them away until the last possible moment. So I don't think Napoleon is completely mild-mannered just because he's not using the death penalty. I think a lot of opposition is being thrown away because he's using conscription. And so your kind of liberal young men who would normally be stirring up progress and political dissent are being marched from hither to thither across Europe, fighting and potentially most likely dying, whether in battles or starvation or disease. And that's basically putting them under a military system. So it's a police state with a huge military focus. And that's what Napoleon comes down to.
Again, I think we could just go around in circles because I think we're just sort of repeating ourselves now. I think death sentences falling is a good thing. I think, Napoleon could have been worse than he was, considering the tools at his disposal and considering the actions of his opponents. I don't think it was a perfect system. I'm not going to argue that, but I think for the time that it was, it was overall, it was admirable compared to what he could have been and what could have been done. I don't buy this sort of, which is what a lot of people do, is the comparisons with Hitler and the sort of modern day dictators. I mean, I'm hesitant to even accept that he was a dictator, which is something which, I'm not the only biographer to do that. There are other historians who agree with that sort of interpretation that he's more of an autocrat than a dictator. But then again, that's the sort of the comparison to the other rulers that are there at the time. I think the Napoleonic regime, in comparison to his opponents' regimes, even in terms of politics, And in terms of the sort of use of imprisonment or the death sentence, or I'm trying to think of a word for that. In terms of punishment of criminals, I still think it compares favourably. And my sort of main point of comparison is Britain, because this is obviously my history of my country and what I've studied. And as I said, Britain has more death penalties at this time. It's under the bloody code. And you say that, he's a dictator, he rises to power in a coup. Yes, but then you have to consider that the coup was a sort of, it was a group conspiracy. Napoleon wasn't the first general of choice. He initially actually expressed hesitancy before he decided to partake in the coup. So it's not the story of this dictator sort of seizing the reins of power. Other people want him to take power. And then you also have to think as well that he has these plebiscites, and I know we discussed these quite a bit on Twitter. But compared to how many people could vote in England at the time, even after Napoleon's rule, a handful of 100,000 people, 300 to 400,000 people. I think it's edging towards 400,000 with the Great Reform Act in the 1830s. But before that, Napoleon has millions of votes, like over millions in his favor, even accounting for the fact that these votes aren't entirely without interference from Napoleon himself, and they aren't exactly running the right way. But then the British electoral system isn't running the right way at this time neither. You have the rotten boroughs, you have the pocket boroughs, you have corruption in Britain. I think overall, if you take the context of the time, Napoleon's system is better for the majority of people. That's my perception.
So just picking up on some points from Luke there. One, really quickly, the plebiscites, because us three interact quite a bit on Twitter, and I welcome anyone else to join in. But the plebiscites, millions of votes were cast for Napoleon. It was just convenient that the army had their votes cast for them, and that was the nation under arms. So I always think that's really convenient, that all the men who were in the army had their votes cast automatically for them, because why would they not want to vote for Napoleon? And I know I'm massively oversimplifying a very complicated issue, but I just think that, especially with some current climates, vote legitimacy is quite important. But no, you keep saying comparing Napoleon to the rest of the European monarchs, and this is it. Napoleon's meant to be better than them. He's meant to be greater than them, according to many. But he's also meant to be continuing the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternity. He doesn't do that. He brings back in a nobility system. And I think that hugely undermines the revolution, but also the middle classes, which were trying to emerge from it. And this nobility are just, some of them are just the worst. Some of them are his family, who are there not for any sort of ability. I mean, most of his family are really quite feckless. I think it's the best description I've read in a book of them, and I keep coming back to. I mean, Joseph especially. He's useless in nearly every single role he does, in the defense of Paris, to trying to rule Spain. He just instigates massacres and looting. I've got to be grateful because his collection that he loots ends up in Apsley House, otherwise I wouldn't have. But in all seriousness, he's terrible. And why does he get this position as the king of Spain? Well, because he's some older brother. So the system that comes in is hugely twisted. It's his family and it's his inner circle. I would go so far as some of them are just his lackeys, and he's bringing them with him from his coup, his military coup, all the way up through. And we see quite a few that fought with him before he was in power, when he was a general, get very quick ascension and become very quickly marshals. And so I think this is showing a real sense of nepotism, but it underlies that Napoleon is there ruling on exam, and it's purely down to his personality and who he wants in those positions.
Yeah, I think Napoleon was better than the other European monarchs, even though he does, as you say, the Empire period, which is my least favorite period, as we can get into later. I still think even at that sort of height of his successes, he was better than the rest of the European monarchs. Because he has a popular legitimacy. And whether you accept that the plebiscites were altered, yes, they were, but they were altered to make victories look better. He already won the plebiscite. So insofar as it's imperfect to measure popular legitimacy in that time, I think the indicators reasonably suggest that Napoleon was popular and that he had the mandate to have his sort of imperial system, which was voted on in the imperial plebiscite, as imperfect as that system was. And it didn't get rid of all meritocracy. meritocracy. There was still meritocracy within the ministries in France, which he'd established. So there was still, and he did have the sort of patronage of the arts and the sciences and the sciences, and the encouragement of these things. So it didn't sort of snuff out all meritocracy, although it's definitely not the sort of the most positive aspect of his rule. But I do still think it's better than absolute monarchy, which is what the French Revolution was taking a stand against. And of course, the plebiscites of Napoleon I inspired the idea of universal suffrage, which goes on under his nephew Napoleon III to actually be established in France as a Bonapartist idea, which I think is miles forward of Britain at the time, with its sort of its limited franchise.
Let me take this back to something that Marcus picked up on earlier, which is the sort of man of peace argument. Essentially, this idea that Napoleon didn't want war, but had enforced upon him by coalition powers, particularly Britain, and that in those instances where he did strike, these were just preemptive strikes designed to get his retaliation in first against the inevitable. Luke, where do you stand on that argument?
I think it would be useless to argue, as some people who support the Napoleonic legend do, that Napoleon was some sort of Gandhi, that he was essentially a pacifist who was always forced into war. But on the other hand, I think that there is some truth. Again, the answer is nuanced as usual. I think Napoleon certainly inherited wars from the French Revolutionary period, which were not wars of his choosing, although, of course, it annoyed the other party's opponents that he was so good at waging them. I think he genuinely wanted the peace of Amiens, the peace with Britain, which he sort of I think that sort of actually aided the popularity of his coup in Brumaire, because there was this general desire for peace, and I think Napoleon sensed that, and his correspondence indicates that he did actually push for that, and he honestly wanted it, and he seemed to have been personally offended at the sort of the British sort of ill will with that peace. Not the will of the British people, of course, because when Amiens is declared, there are sort of mass popular demonstrations in London in favour of Napoleon. Huzzah for Bonaparte and all that sort of thing. But from the sort of the British upper classes, who I think were always sort of uneasy with the peace, because fundamentally they didn't like Napoleon, and France was the sort of great historic rival and an enemy of Britain. And I think there are historians who would place quite fairly the breach of Amiens not with Napoleon, but with his opponents. Where I do think the man of peace argument falls is after Napoleon's defeat with Russia before his first abdication. I think he's offered a reasonable peace on terms which I would consider to be reasonable. And I suspect that many people in France would have considered them to be reasonable as well. But I think at that time, he obviously says he wants peace, but not on any terms. And I think this is something which Britain feels like the same as well. None of these countries were peace at any price. This was a time of power politics. This was a time of invasions and of war and of empire building. But even considering all that, I think Napoleon pushed it before his first abdication, and he was offered quite reasonable terms, which, for whatever reason, suspicion of Austria, the desire to secure better terms through another military victory, which never came. I think the man of peace argument falls there. But I do think that there is some merit to the idea that not all of Napoleon's wars were of his own doing, and some of them were indeed defensive. And I would argue the same, even, I know this is contentious, but I would argue the same from the return from Elba as well in the 100 Days.
Let's stay with the return from Elba then. Do you feel that when he turned around to the coalition powers as they were prepping for that final war of coalition, and he said that he was after peace, do you feel that was genuine in the sense that he didn't want peace because he was buying time, he wasn't really in a position to be able to fight them off all at once? Or do you think that he genuinely would have preferred to have just settled in France with the borders as they were, and ruled a much smaller French empire from the one that he had established a decade earlier?
This is a tricky one, isn't it? Because he says at St. Helena, I think there's a comment at St. Helena that he would have sort of, the first opportunity he got from a great victory, that he would have done away with the sort of liberal reforms which he promised when he returns in 1815. But at the same time, I think the radicals in Britain who were sort of favourable to Napoleon, I mean, the return from Elba, if you allow me to sort of just contextualise a little bit, opinion turns against Napoleon quite vastly across Europe, even with his supporters after the first abdication. And on his way to Elba, he sees himself getting shot and hung in effigy. And I think this does actually change the man to some extent, because he realises that he's not as popular as he perhaps once thought. But when he returns from Elba, I mean, this is one of my favourite sort of, I said at the start that this is a great story. I mean, the man literally retakes an entire country without firing a single shot. The king flees. And from my own research, that there is a turn in popular perceptions in Britain at this time. People at first thought that the Bourbon Restoration would be a good thing for France, but then they realized that the Bourbons actually continued some of the negatives of Napoleon's regime. So the censorship continues, and some even argued at the time it seemed to be worse than under Napoleon. So you have British radicals in Britain arguing, hang on, we didn't want to sort of return the sort of ancien regime with British blood. And there is a sense that Britain was wrong not to trust Napoleon when he says that he wants peace. It was sort of unchristian of Britain to sort of assume that Napoleon was just going to wage another war. There was the idea that it was wrong to sort of declare war on one man after all the arguments that had been raised against assassination and the principles behind that. And you do see a change, even people that were negative towards Napoleon in Britain, that there is literature at this time which people are saying, well, you should wait until Napoleon breaches the peace and give him the benefit of the doubt, because it sets a terrible principle for sort of Britain to decide to preemptively invade or attack a country's chosen ruler, because don't forget there is another plebiscite, just because they suspect him or they dislike his system. And I have much sympathy for that perspective. I think that it was a time of hope for many people, and even in Britain. And I think that you can see this when Napoleon docks, when he's eventually defeated at Waterloo, and he briefly docks in Britain, from the crowds that gather around his ship and cheer and even take their hats off in respect for him. And this is something which worries the British ruling classes. So yeah, I do think we can't know for certain whether Napoleon would have stuck with the reforms of 1815, but I think he may have been compelled to do so, whether he liked it or not, just because of the tide of public opinion in France. I think he would have been forced into a position where he would have had to have kept a more forward system than had been previously the case.
1815, I just think, is staggering. I don't actually believe that Napoleon did want peace. I don't think the peace was possible. And Napoleon, if anything, was not stupid. He must have known that peace was not possible when he came back, when he escaped Elba. He'd been given very favourable terms by basically being created emperor on Elba. And he could have, lived his life there quite comfortably. Many of his followers and some of his family followed him out there. And he had the opportunity to actually reform a micronation. And it wouldn't have been dishonourable. To return to France was only there to reinstate power. And I think, the reinstate power for who? For himself. He was not going to be doing this for the glory of France. And if it was for glory, was it worth the sacrifice and the cost? And this is what really, I want to say, upsets me about 1815 and about Waterloo. I don't really see Waterloo being honourable or glorious. I see it being vital in defeating Napoleon. Europe needed final peace if he was going to come back, and that's what people commemorate. But coming back, war was always going to be inevitable. Whether that was Napoleon declaring it after he came back and he's completely reintroduced conscription. So I don't think he wanted peace. I think the idea that war was declared on him and that was unfair is not entirely fair or true, purely because he reintroduced conscription and to such a wider level than before. Calling up the National Guard into the army and mobilizing so many different forces. But it was not going to be an option. The other nations of Europe were never going to allow him to return. They'd already declared him in exile, and to allow him to come back would have been allowed him to have completely free reign. And Napoleon must have known this, that war was going to happen. on there. But going back to the original, was he a man of peace? Well, something we see in a lot of conflicts is not necessarily the aggressor, is the person that legally declares war. And this is used so many times by people apologizing for Napoleon, saying, not Luke, he's admitted, but I see it so much out there. People go, oh, but the Allies declared war and Britain declared war first. And it's like Britain wanted these wars all the time. And I will admit, between the Whigs and the Tories, there were some who wanted to deflect from internal strife and problems. It's a classic thing we see, you know, the Falklands War in '82. Why was war declared? But to distract from internal problems. But I think it was here a case of people declaring war because they knew that war was inevitable. And so to strike first and to mobilize coalitions was wise. And I am not comparing Napoleon to Hitler, but just the circumstances of 1939 politically of Britain declared war on Germany because it was the only option. They had pushed and pushed and pushed, and to not declare war at that point was weakness. And for Britain was financing lots of these wars, but Britain needed to declare these wars. Napoleon was certainly aggressor in so many of these cases. So to take Spain and Portugal individually, Portugal wanted to defy the continental system, and I think rightly so. They had an outstanding relationship with Britain, and we had a trade agreement that went back to the 1400s, and it was really strong. We celebrated it quite recently, personally, with the Apsley House, with the embassy in Lisbon. So they were forced into a position where they had to concede to the continental system. Napoleon was effectively ordering an army to be marched towards the gates of Lisbon. And what's always forgotten is the Portuguese government did concede. They actually broke off trade with Britain, and they legally declared war on Britain so far to actually try to do an embargo on their ships in harbour. Now, they probably didn't want to actually ever act on this war. It's a bit like Britain and Finland during the World War II. But it did happen. Portugal conceded to all demands, and they were still invaded. And after the invasion came the massacres. Spain, for example, was France's ally. Only 2 years earlier, they were fighting with France against Nelson's fleet at Trafalgar. And then, for no reason other than, I believe, a power grab, Napoleon takes the king and the crown prince of Spain, puts them under house arrest, and puts his brother, Joseph, who I've already said is just pretty useless, on the throne. And I can't see any reason on this other than a power grab over to the Iberian Peninsula. So he doesn't declare war on either. He just invades and takes over. Spain, he's already infiltrated because his army's been marching to Portugal. So Napoleon certainly is an aggressor. A man of peace, not at all. A warmonger, maybe I wouldn't go that far, but he's certainly a man who liked war because he was good at it.
Luke, let me give you the opportunity to come back on any of that.
Yeah, okay, so Spain was not Napoleon's finest hour. I don't think you'll find anybody that would argue that it was. I think Napoleon fundamentally misunderstood Spain. I think he genuinely thought that he was spreading good ideas and that his ideas were of civilization, and that, you know, the Spanish people were sort of ungrateful for not just accepting those ideas. But then that's why he fundamentally misunderstood Spain, and it's one of his greatest mistakes, is that, you know, people like to be ruled by their own people. And certainly this is the case in the sort of fiery history of Spain, particularly in the 19th century. But to Napoleon, there's this sense that Spain was just sort of initially it was just sort of a sideshow, but then this is a great miscalculation, isn't it? Because in the end, he refers to it as a sort of sore eventually inside. Yeah. So I think his intentions were perhaps good, but then of course, his methods are certainly questionable, and it all goes wrong in Spain, basically, doesn't it? So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to defend that in any way, other than to say that he genuinely thought his ideas would be well received by the people of Spain. Of course, he was mistaken. On the return from Elba, I can just reiterate that there were journalists and even, you know, people in the House of Commons who argued that, you know, it wasn't right to go to war with Napoleon until he returned to his old ways, and that sort of destroying a foreign government by arms was a fatal precedent, which was worse than Napoleon's continental rule. And this was an argument which went right through the time. So it wasn't, the case of Britain against Napoleon at the time. There was division, and even after the defeat of Waterloo, there's a huge sense in at least sort of working, or as far as we can tell, working class publications and radical publications. There's a sense of that this was a British blood propping up a Bourbon throne, and this is something which wasn't liked. And then there was the perception that it sort of it was a victory for the Tory politics of Wellington and his sort of political ideas over the liberal ideas which Napoleon had, the more liberal ideas which Napoleon had promised. Whether you believe whether he would have implemented them or not is a separate issue. At the time, he had promised these things, so it was seen as a defeat of liberty, and it was by the lower class, sort of working class radicals going forward after Napoleon's defeat, and it was incredibly difficult for Britain to sort of discuss that legacy in some ways, and we can talk about that later if you like. But just on the point of Elba quickly, I think Marcus recently wrote a really good article in Military History Now about Wellington's victories, and he concluded it by saying, it was Wellington's daring that made him great. Well, I can't think of anything more daring than a single individual retaking an entire country and making the king flee without firing a shot. I can't think of anything more daring than that.
No, it's an amazing story. I think it's just very sad that it causes so many deaths, especially in France. But daring, it sounds like something out of a spy novel, a man coming back, slipping over the back wall and ending up in the capital and taking the throne without firing a shot. No, it does sound fantastic. But I would also add that Napoleon wasn't also wildly, welcomed back. There were moderates within the French Parliament that didn't want him there, and there's the idea of like kind of the passive resistance within there, knowing that they couldn't get rid of him. And then you look at the Vendée in Western France, and they went into armed revolt very quickly, and a large part of Napoleon's army ends up having to go put down that rebellion, and they put it down really bloodily. These are like armed peasants who basically go into protest within their borders. They're not trying to invade out. And Napoleon's forces go in and they do start killing and looting within their own French borders. So there is a resistance, and that's just one area that's gone into arms. I've read things, I believe, from Rory Muir about kind of more passive French resistance, purely because the country was so tired of war. I was saying that Britain was, and men who'd been born into this, but France has got war on its borders, and they're sending young men, and by this point old men, off to fight wars for like 20 years plus. And so people are just absolutely exhausted at the idea of another war. What Napoleon does do very well is he motivates people, and he brings this idea of the glory and all this chanting that comes with the eagles and the flags, and he's very good at that. And so I think that's what motivates the army. But I think the general population and the idea of conscription again is absolutely exhausting, to the point of just lying down and doing what he's saying, but only because there's no other real option for many of them.
Surely the one area where we can all agree is on Napoleon's skill as a commander, though. Marcus, even if you can't stand his politics, his personality, you've got to stand in awe of the guy, his ability on the battlefield, what he managed to achieve as a result in terms of building the French Empire.
I mean, yes, it's impressive. But the Colosseum's impressive, and that was built for really horrible means for some of it. Yes, Napoleon is a fantastic commander. The problem is, my problem with everything with Napoleon is the exaggeration of his ability as a commander. There's this really weird kind of like infographic that does the rounds about Napoleon, Wellington, Caesar, and I think Genghis Khan. And also, thank you very much, Luke, for reading the article and enjoying it on Ministry of History Now. Thank you. That's very kind. I didn't say that before.
Oh, it's very good. Very good.
Yeah, I don't think Waterloo is the most important battle of the Duke of Wellington. That's purely because he faces Napoleon means it's relevant to today as well. It's sung about. But there's this infographic that does the rounds, and it lists the number of battles. And so in preparation of this, I was starting to list all their battles and their draws and their major overwhelming victories. And yes, funnily enough, Napoleon's got won more battles than almost anyone else. And there is a reason for that. He, as we were saying earlier, he is going out and causing conflict, whether that's them declaring war on him or him invading other nations. And he does, let's look at France as well as Spain. He is invading his allies. He is causing war, whether that's through his politics and forcing people to fight him or him actually going out and doing it. So funnily enough, he does fight more battles, so therefore he wins more. But as with portion, he loses more than Wellington. Wellington doesn't lose a pitched battle. He loses Burgos and some rearguard retreats, and he doesn't lose a pitch-fought battle of a large build-up. Napoleon does, and when he loses campaigns, such as the retreat from Russia, he loses it in spectacular form. His cavalry are decimated. His men barely arrive out, and many who do not only are traumatized mentally, which is never really studied, the psychological effects that these men are having to go through of A, traveling such a long way from their home borders, but B, the horrors that they've experienced and inflicted. I think is quite right to say in Russia as well. This is my turning point against Napoleon, was the horrors that they inflicted on other nations. But these men are coming out with toes missing, and they're seeing their best friends die in front of them from a Cossack or a Russian lady slit their throats. It's devastating. So yes, Napoleon's very good at war, and when it all goes his way, he's spectacular, and he's the master of maneuver strategy. We look at the 1814 campaign where he's fighting on his own borders, and he's everywhere. He reminds me of the Prince of Orange character in Sharp. I shall be everywhere. He is everywhere. It's an amazingly fought campaign. Turning battles against the Prussians one day and the Austrians 2 days later, and speed marches that no one else would have thought be possible. But it's this: does he need to be fighting them? He's got a lot of experience in war, because I still believe he's causing the wars, and that is the nub of Napoleon for me, that we've got so much to study about, but the suffering that lies underneath it is really palpable.
Luke, I want to come straight to you on this. Napoleon, incredible commander, right?
Well, I'm not a military historian, so I don't know very much other than secondary sources about the sort of nuts and bolts of how to wage war and how to wage battle. But what I do know is that from the hundreds of newspapers and pamphlets from the 19th century that I read, not all of them favorable to Napoleon, many of them critical, there seemed to be a large general consensus in those newspapers from people who know much more about waging battles than I do, that Napoleon was a military genius. And this is the phrase which is used again and again and again. And, the Pall Mall Gazette, which is usually critical of Bonapartism, in 1867, it called Napoleon the greatest conqueror and military genius since Caesar. And then, the Duke of Wellington himself, there are quotes in which he seems to consider Napoleon to be the greatest general of the age. And of course, there's the famous thing where he said his presence in the field is worth 40,000 men. And also, you've just got to look at the legacy of his victories. When Napoleon III again embarks on an invasion of Italy in the mid-19th century, the British Foreign Secretary wrote down that Austerlitz and Jena will hardly be repeated. Such was the legacy of these battles, that they were sort of a standard and a marking point of good warfare and how to wage war. Of course, again, I would debate that Napoleon was causing these wars and that he was always the cause of these wars. Or perhaps it was more the sort of often unfair perceptions of his opponents, which thought that they had to wage war against him, which I think was often the case. I mean, certainly with Amiens, you can argue that I don't think Napoleon caused that breach of the peace. And again, we can go around in circles with 1815. But yeah, despite all the comments in the 19th century, I mean, I've read hundreds of these newspapers, despite all the disagreements about his politics and what that might mean, there's this idea that he was a brilliant soldier and he was just a great military commander, which which I think is something of a shame, really, and it's which perhaps you don't expect me to say, and because it sort of allows Britain to get out easily, if you like, because it focuses attention on Napoleon's military side and his military victories, which makes Britain's defeat of Napoleon look even more impressive. So it makes the British look great. And it's in some ways easier for them to sort of discuss it. But what it does is it avoids the much more awkward questions of Napoleon's politics and his system of rule and his administration and his popularity with lower class radicals in Britain. And all these sort of awkward questions which open up things which are much more difficult for British sense of national identity. So I think it's somewhat convenient to remember him as a military genius because, hey, look, the British, albeit as part of a sort of coalition effort, we defeated a military genius. So yeah, I think, but I wouldn't dispute. I think he was a great soldier, and I've not seen much dispute of that neither.
No, I think Luke's raised a really interesting point that, if we were swatting away this stereotypical French army that runs away all the time like it does in a Hollywood film or in Sharp or something like that, there wouldn't be any glory in it for ourselves. And so for the British press to say that Napoleon was great as a military commander means that our own glories were better, and they weren't running away all the time. That is a really widely unfair stereotype that was often brought in. And they won some fantastic victories. You just need to look at Jena and Austerlitz. There's so many before I start quoting them. But when Napoleon gets involved at some, Borodino, it's almost like he doesn't want to be there at the battle. He sulks in the rear, refusing to send in the Imperial Guard. And it just doesn't seem sometimes that he's motivated. He does have wild mood swings. And even during the Russian campaign, he pauses to have a birthday parade when they could have actually been pursuing the Russians. And it allows one of the Russian corps to slip out over a river. Russian campaign is not my strong point, but I know he pauses for a day because it's his birthday. So he causes all the corps to stop and celebrate his birthday. All I'm going to finish off with is a quote that if it was the Tsar of Russia before Waterloo, before they'd even faced each other, he called Napoleon the world's conqueror, and then called Wellington the conqueror of the world's conqueror.
What I would say about the Russia campaign is, and some of the other campaigns, Waterloo being another example, is that this wasn't necessarily Napoleon at his best for a variety of reasons that can be discussed on another episode. But so I wouldn't kind of consider Borodino and some of the things that happened in that campaign and what happens in the Waterloo campaign. Admittedly, there's debate about to what extent was he really ill, to be representative of the guy's skill. Like you've mentioned already, 1814, which has so many parallels with the skill of the early Italian campaigns.
Correct.
And I think when Napoleon brought his A game, he was probably unbeatable. Would you say that's fair?
His maneuver is fantastic. It really, especially his maneuver and his lightning strikes. But what you want with a commander often is consistency. If they're always going to be bad, they might get relegated to another job. If they're always going to be good, victory is assured. With Napoleon, you're not quite sure what you're going to get. It's a bit like ringing up for a takeaway. You order a margarita pizza. You don't want to get a meat feast if you're a vegetarian, do you? You want to get some consistency down the line. And Napoleon doesn't bring consistency. I don't know where that analogy came from. But
I love that. Napoleon's like ordering a pizza. Brilliant. That's great because pizza's my favourite food as well.
It's lunchtime and I'm quite hungry. Girlfriend's out, so I might order a pizza. But he doesn't bring consistency to it, and it's that problem that we want consistency from commanders because we know what they're going to deliver both on and off the battlefield. And Napoleon causing birthday parades, having illnesses, it's not his fault, but he's often ill, so he's not present or sulking. He has wild mood swings, and he's known to, when he demands peace in 1814, he throws his hat on the floor. That's not very imperial. So yeah, he can be one of the most fantastic commanders, but he can be quite apathetic at times, looking at Borodino especially. And that is strange, as I'm just going to leave it with, I think.
We definitely need to get t-shirts made. Napoleon is like ordering a takeaway when it comes to battle. But let's move it on. To be honest, we could do an entire episode just on this itself, but let's talk about Napoleon's legacy. Luke, I want to come to you first because I know you've actually written about this. What is Napoleon's legacy, both globally and within France? Because he's not the only leader of France to actually bear this name, is he?
No, so Napoleon I, his legacy, I wrote my master's thesis on this idea that it must be seen through the sort of lens of Napoleon III, because Napoleon III takes great inspiration from his uncle, of course. And he sort of, he revises what Napoleon meant to Europe in a way which you can quite rightly call propaganda in his book, Napoleonic Ideas, which to a large extent, it sort of, it sort of cements the legend, if you like, this idea that, you know, his wars were defensive. He was a sort of large liberal emperor and this liberal ruler, which is what Napoleon III wanted to be seen as. And also that he sort of contributed toward the unification of Italy, and this idea that he was his sort of centralizing through the Code Napoleon, this sort of thing, was all about creating nation states, which he would eventually sort of remove this imperial glue from them in the end and give them their sort of sovereignty. Now you can debate like how much Napoleon was actually going to sort of release the reins of power, because of course on Saint Helena, Napoleon himself says that is exactly what he was going to do. He had his eye on Italian unification, and it's debatable because his actual policies at the time look like, you know, he didn't have the intention to do that. However, I do think it's a positive thing that he inspired future rulers like Napoleon III to take this more liberal idea and the more positive ideas from his reign and to push for reform with it. So you have Napoleon III, as I say, you know, he championed universal suffrage in France, which is, of course, a progressive idea which we welcome and we all enjoy today. He champions Italian reunification, and that's why he's commemorated with Napoleon I in the Museum of Italian Reunification. And of course, at the start of the episode, we talked about the Code Napoleon. You know, that is the foundation of so many modern governmental systems, which we all still benefit from. Not least, you know, the idea of a sort of professional civil service with ministries and a meritocratic system within there. In Britain, though, which is what I sort of focused on, Napoleon's legacy and how he was interpreted in Britain, he provided a lot of inspiration for want of a better expression, working class people, as far as we can tell from the evidence, who were seeking reform in Britain. So they used him as a sort of stick to beat the Duke of Wellington and his sort of anti-reform Tory policies with. They said, you know, that they tended to agree with Napoleon's liberal intentions, whether they were actual or not, we can debate. But the fact that they inspired such movements, I think, who were on the right side of history, of course, the Chartists, you know, the idea of universal suffrage in the People's Charter, I don't think many people would disagree with that today. The fact that Napoleon provided them certainly with a symbol of inspiration. I mean, they printed the Escape from Elba, the Flight of the Eagle, on the Chartist calendar in their newspapers. I think that's important because it gave radicals and later Chartists and working class people a sort of a symbol to rally behind for reform. And there are all sorts of interesting examples of this in my thesis. But I'll try and pick out one. There was a sort of amusing discussion when there was another sort of invasion scare in Britain at the time that Napoleon III came to power, because of course they know that Napoleon had the intention of invading England, and people suspected Napoleon III. And there was a meeting in 1852 of working men in Preston, and they hilariously argued that Wellington should fight Napoleon III himself because, you know, they hadn't gained anything from Waterloo, and it was only Wellington that gained from the sort of the suffering of British troops. And this is you know, it's quite a popular perception in Britain at the time, and you know, Queen Victoria herself becomes sympathetic to Bonapartist ideas to the extent that in the 1870s, Theo Aronson, who's a great sort of historian of Bonapartism, says that she becomes a Bonapartist herself. And you get this sympathy for Napoleon in Britain, which comes from his defeat and his imprisonment on St. Helena. He says all sorts of things for British identity. So there's this idea of guilt the fact that of his poor treatment with Hudson Lowe, which is something which Queen Victoria talked about as well, and the idea that they want to make amends for this, which is really interesting, because a lot of the working class newspapers in Victorian Britain, they didn't like Napoleon III. You know, they sort of slandered him with the same terms which Napoleon I had been slandered with, you know, monster, bloodstained tyrant, usurper, all this sort of thing. And they tried to get working class people not to sort of celebrate Napoleon III when he came for a state visit in England. But this backfires spectacularly, and he's greeted by large crowds. And part of the reason these working class journalists, they try and sort of figure out, okay, well, what's gone wrong? We've told the workers to not sort of greet Napoleon III. They've done it anyway. Why is this? And the interesting conclusion they come to is that in cheering for Napoleon III, these sort of masses seem to be thinking that they're making amends for the wrongs of Waterloo and St. Helena and the Bourbon Restoration. This idea that Britain did something wrong with Waterloo, and they're actually saying, well, no, we don't want to cause any sort of pain to France. And this is not my conclusion. This is something that they reach in the newspapers themselves. And I think there's much truth in that. The idea that Napoleon had these sort of forward ideas, which were snuffed out for much longer than they had to be at Waterloo. And I think it's the ideas, these ideas, the positive forward ideas behind the man, rather than the more negative ideas, which I know Marcus is going to emphasize, which gives me a sort of a more sort of positive perception of him.
I want to talk a little bit about demography as well, the kind of the population impact, if you like, because as with all wars, success is built on loss of human life. And there are those who argue fairly convincingly that there was a colossal impact in terms of a generation of young Frenchmen going off to war and many of them dying. Would you agree with that? And in your opinion, does the human cost outweigh the benefits or not? Because I don't want to put words in your mouth here.
I think if I could sort of go back in a time capsule to history, I would have rather have fought for Napoleon at Waterloo than for the Allied armies, simply with the hope that he might have been genuine with his liberal reforms and his promised more liberal constitution, because I think that they were miles ahead of what his opponents had planned and in store at the time, and I think they were inspiring ideas to rally around. So I think there's a good quote from a biographer of Napoleon, Thompson, and he says that there was little that Napoleon had done which could not have been thought excusable if he'd been a Bourbon or a Habsburg. And, you know, his armies committed atrocities, but so did the Russian guerrillas and even British soldiers in Spain. And I think I'm more inclined to be sympathetic towards that view, in that, you know, he was good at war in an age of intense war and power rivalry, an age where Britain is expanding its own empire. And many of the criticisms of Napoleon were turned against him in Britain. You know, they called him a usurper. Well, the British usurped in India, which was a common one. Well, how can you call him a usurper in India? You know, there was racist attacks which said he was, you know, it emphasized his Corsican ancestry. And it's like, well, King George III had German ancestry. I think there's a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of criticism leveled at him purely because he was this soldier who managed to rise to power.
Marcus, if nothing else, Napoleon has given us a spectacular tomb at Les Invalides in Paris. He gave us Sharp, Hornblower, Master and Commander. There's cultural legacy there. I mean, he's even given us a job arguing about him. Surely we can be grateful for that at least.
I think it's hilarious. We're giving him legacy credit for his own tomb. He was buried in St. Helena in almost near disgrace. But so it wasn't until 1840 he came back. Yeah, the tomb's pretty. But kind of, I just don't think, there's no way that the legacy, and it always comes back to glory with Napoleon. There's no way that glory is worth somewhere between 3 and 7 million deaths. I've seen some that range it up to 10 million, but that's not as widely accepted. But yeah, we're talking at least around 5 million deaths. I'm not quite sure that a marble tomb, it's like 7 layers deep and people go in and chant Vive, Vive l'Empereur over and over, is worth it. In fact, it kind of sickens me that the irony that shouting Long Live the Emperor when he's long dead in basically a tomb. No, it's not worth it. I mean, I love Sharp. possibly even more than you, Zach. And I'm very grateful for that. But I'm not quite sure the legacy and the suffering. The atrocities that I read in Spain, especially, you think they're meant to be their recent allies, almost broke me. They were really sickening. It's not just the murdering. They said it was like a plague of locusts when the French army appeared, because they would strip everything bare. But it's the raping and the psychological warfare that they're using to suppress population purely because they're not French, so therefore they're different to them. It's deeply upsetting, and they are atrocities, crimes of war. Now, Britain is no angel in this era, and something I know, Zach's writing about brilliantly is the crimes that the British Army did and the punishment system. But that's very much, I feel, to survive, to eat additional rations when it wasn't forthcoming, and not to go out and repress a population, and to such a horrific extent. The other legacies, something that three of us enjoy talking about, is I think the art and culture, and that doesn't necessarily have to directly be because of Napoleon, but is kind of related to the era. So where we've got Beethoven, who was a huge admirer of Napoleon until he crowns himself emperor, or at least until first consul for life, and betrays the revolution as he sees it, and then starts rededicating his great symphonies no longer to being to Napoleon. In fact, there's the Peninsular War one in the end. And to link it in, I think the reason that why Zach invited me very kindly in today is because of the art in Apsley House, where you've got the heart of it's the Spanish Royal Collection, which Joseph Bonaparte was looting from Spain, and basically taking it back to Paris. The Bonapartes did this all across Europe. This was not unique. It's why there's so many amazing museums in Paris. But you've got things like Canova. Canova as Napoleon Mars the Peacemaker. Now, that's an ironic title for anyone who knows their classics as a starter. But it's a beautiful statue. Canova was the master of a marble. And it sits in Apsley House, basically fully nude. And it's a really interesting one because Napoleon hated it. It's about 11 foot tall. It's very flattering, and it's just a beautiful piece of art. The reason Napoleon hated it is he was kind of convinced by Canova to have it nude, apart from the fig leaf's original, and there's a toga draped over one shoulder only. And Canova, we think, was doing this because by the time that he'd had time to improve the design of it, the war had ravaged Europe so much, and so much of this art had been looted, that Canova felt personally offended by the Bonapartes, Napoleon especially, for looting art in Europe. And so to paint him in this kind of, he convinced Napoleon in sculpted, not painted, in a classical style of this fig leaf only, was actually mocking him. And Napoleon, when he saw it, said, "Non, c'est trop athlétique. It is too athletic," and hid it behind a screen in the Musée Napoleon, which is now the Louvre. And hid it away. And as a footnote, lots of the art that Canova and his friends and his colleagues actually was returned by both personally by Wellington and by the Allies at the end of the war. And Canova was so grateful, he actually presented a marble head to the Duke of Wellington to be thankful. So Napoleon's legacy to me is one of looting and destruction across Europe, and anything else is a positive that we must be thankful for. But the price was too high to pay. And did we need it? No, especially Waterloo. Nothing was gained from that at all, except for more devastation. I remember, really vividly, though people at the beginning of the campaign, you've got accounts like Captain Cavalier Mercer, who cheer jingoism, pure jingoism, they basically cheer, "One more chance to have a pop at Boney, huzzah, my lads," and they all run out the barracks, clutching their newspapers that war's been declared. But at the end, when you've got people like Captain Leach, Peninsula veterans, and they have to turn away from the battlefield because it's so destructive, and Wellington himself, who breaks down in tears for over half an hour, having seen the list of the dead and the dying that includes his friends, and swears to never fight a war again. They say Wellington, Luke said Wellington should have fought the war himself with Napoleon. I think he probably would have been sacrifice he would have gladly made, would be to fight a duel with Napoleon to prevent the many young men who died on that day.
Mind you, Wellington wasn't a very good shot, so in terms of outcomes, it might have been very different. Luke, I want to give you the chance to respond there.
I think in terms of sort of emphasizing the negative aspects of Napoleon's reign, and that's a sort of fair interpretation. I mean, nobody's going to justify looting. I certainly won't. Nobody's going to justify sort of horrific crimes committed by soldiers. I'm not going to do that neither. I just think that in the context of the time, this was a battle of ideas, and Waterloo in the end came down to a battle of ideas as well. And I think that too often the ideas represented by Napoleon were more forward than those of his opponents, and that the negatives which his opponents sort of accused Napoleon of could be too often turned against themselves as well. So I think that often these were wars which didn't have to be fought, but I think it is a case of the British thought that they were spreading civilization in India. Napoleon thought that he was spreading civilization in Spain. It's an era of bad ideas, but within the bad ideas there are good. And I do think that if you look at it in terms of ideas and systems, I think Napoleon has it. I just do, because I think history goes in his favor eventually in terms of the reforms which happen in Britain. Yes, it happens slower, but it eventually ends up somewhere where Napoleon was already at in 1815. Not all of the art was negative about Napoleon. We haven't mentioned his sort of cultivation of the arts in Egypt, and how the Egyptian adventure really sort of advanced Egyptology, and how Napoleon was a sort of intense reader of essays in art, science, history, geography, how he himself took part in a sort of survey of the Suez area in Egypt, and how the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, and how he published all these in volumes when he got back from Egypt, because he insisted on taking experts and intellectuals with him to Egypt, because he saw the importance of forwarding sort of these sort of ideas, and yeah, so he wasn't just always the enemy of artists and art. And plus, I like his empire style of art and architecture, which helps as well.
I want to dwell a bit on the pro and anti-Napoleon camps and their origins. Luke, where does the anti-Napoleon perspective come from, in your opinion?
I think much of it comes from the what's known as the Black Legend, which Britain plays a large part in. So you have much propaganda in Britain which is just slanderous at the time of Israel. So Napoleon's depicted as a dragon, as a lizard. He's given terms like bloodstained tyrant, usurper. He's always depicted as this tiny thing, head on a spike, and all this. And I think that the British, calls for his assassination are made even at certain times. And I think that the British propaganda, it goes over the top. It crosses the line in terms of its dehumanizing rhetoric. This idea of Napoleon as an antichrist crops up quite a bit. And you can see why Napoleon was annoyed about it as well, because he wasn't the devil incarnate. He wasn't an Adolf Hitler. He wasn't really, as you say, compare him to the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. His rule was comparatively mild compared to what it could have been, or what it could have been like, and even compared to other people at the time. I think a lot of it does originate in Britain, but interestingly, I think Victorian Britons actually saw through a lot of this. And you can see towards the end of the 19th century, a lot of the public commentators come to appreciate Napoleon. That there seems to have been something of a shift again after the Second World War, where I think Napoleon is wrongly associated with Hitler, and that has sort of revived negative perceptions of him as a sort of dictator, no matter how many historians sort of push against that idea. I do think that has sort of revived a negative perception of him. But yeah, I think Britain has a lot to answer for in terms of its propaganda.
Marcus, what about the pro-Napoleon camp? What do we owe that to?
I think we owe that to the era and Napoleon himself. We look at it is the propaganda that he is commissioning of himself in the era, and those who directly within his inner circle who are trying to create an image to flatter him. And Napoleon loves to be flattered, loves to be thought of as this great new house. He kind of slightly exaggerates the history of the Bonaparte family to give them more aristocracy. And that's why he's bringing his family up with him to try to make them look like nobles. especially his elder brothers and some of his close sisters, and marrying them onto his generals. But the paintings and the images of all the men cheering, and this great grey stallion rearing up, and the even the coup de Brumaire paintings that you see, which was completely bumbled by Napoleon. And it just creates this real cult and this real legacy, which is hugely unhelpful and untrue. I see it completely persist today in America and online. People get very offensive in the defense and personally attack anyone who has a word to say against Napoleon. And if you don't think he was near godlike, then you're wrong, and they'll put expletives basically in there. And I've been on the receiving end of that. There's no middle ground for some of these people, and it's fascinating, genuinely fascinating from a viewpoint to try to study where this propaganda has been so successful. I mean, I disagree with Luke, I'm afraid to say. I strongly think he was a dictator, and in fact I think he was a tyrant. But damn, was he a successful one in creating that image. This is something that could almost be praised by dictators that come since. The Dictator's Handbook, how to do things. If he hadn't probably fought war on so many fronts at the same time, he possibly could have won this, especially the first time round. Doing Spain and Russia were both unnecessary, and if he just consolidated his power, then it would have probably been a completely different story. British expeditions, the Flanders campaign failed abysmally. So I think he did very well in cultivating this image, this reputation. But I think where it probably fell short as well was he started to believe his own hype. He believed that he was undefeatable in battle, that he was this amazing commander, that he was this liberal ruler, where I just don't think the facts stack up to any of that. Impressive, certainly. I'm always impressed by Napoleon, but the cult, the legacy is too strong for many cases.
Luke, Napoleon believed his own hype. I'm not convinced that you'd agree with that, so I want to give you the chance to chip in.
Well, the quote I mentioned earlier in the discussion is actually from Frank McLean's biography of Napoleon. I think it's on page 666, quite fittingly, which is quite interesting. He says, Napoleon was an autocrat but not a totalitarian dictator. And I'm inclined to agree with that, because the term dictator has taken on all the negative connotations of Hitler and Stalin since then. And I think in the context of the time, I think autocrat is a more fair way to put it. And as I said, Napoleon was a brilliant propagandist. I'm not going to deny that. And it's funny that Marcus sort of acknowledged that as well. He was talking about how brilliant Napoleon was with propaganda, and that's almost like a good thing. That's almost to say he was so clever with how to use propaganda. And I'm not going to deny that he did that. But I also don't think that. I think that was sort of necessary to an extent, that he wanted to sort of try and inspire and unify Paris. Don't forget, he was fighting wars against all sorts of enemies, and this was a marvelous way to sort of rally people around him, which is necessary for him to sort of win the war for France. So I think that there is a positive aspect to that as well. Of course, as historians, we can pick it apart and say, well, no, that didn't really happen, and that didn't really happen. And but the sort of public image and the public portrayal of it is admirable in its skill as propaganda. In terms of him, just being a tyrant and all this sort of thing, as I say, that even with you look at the code, the Napoleon, how that was written, he did listen to the Council of State. He did have respect for experts and intellectuals. He was a very questioning individual. He would ask questions because he wanted to know more. He had a very inquiring mind. This is why people call him a genius, because he was just capable of he had this marvelous ability, which I haven't yet managed to master myself, but I wish I could, of closing one drawer and opening another. And then it's a different subject. He's waging wars, and then he's writing letters left, right, and centre about all different manners of subjects to do with governance. So no, I don't think he has all the characteristics which define the modern connotations of a dictator, because he listened too much. He listened too much to his own counsel. And of course, these qualities sort of wither away as the empire expands. And historians like to sort of try and date, when did Napoleon change? For Beethoven, it was when he became emperor. For me, I think it's when he divorces Josephine, because I think he loses a lot of the admirable sort of aspects of his character at that point. And he does change as a person. I think it's more the earlier Napoleon, which people find very inspiring, rather than the sort of arrogant emperor that he becomes towards his first abdication. But then again, the return from Elba for many is a story of redemption. You know, he sees his mistakes, he comes back and he says, well, no, we're going to have reform. And then he puts through, you know, the abolition of slavery and other sort of admirable reforms. So he's a very complex character, and people will always try and, I mean, hundreds of years people have discussed what is Napoleon's character, what does he mean, is he more positive, is he more negative? My personal perception of him is more positive, because I arrive at this conclusion based on who he inspired, and his sort of ideas in context to other people. But then, of course, if you look at the more negative aspects of him, it's understandable why people would dislike him. But I do think it's unfair to call him a dictator, an overall dictator, considering the modern connotations of the term. And I think tyrant is perhaps too far. I mean, certainly not in France. I don't think he was a tyrant in France. I think there are instances of his reign which can be considered tyranny elsewhere and further afield, but I think to call him a tyrant overall is unfair.
It kind of comes down to the overall empire. To me, it's, you know, to go back to Spain and Portugal and Russia, the legacy there was near tyrannical, and I think that's why I use that term, and it is to hold a mirror up to the cult Napoleon and people who apologise for the actions there, which Luke's not doing. But you know, they're not acceptable. They are really difficult to read. They're actually, like, kind of historically difficult to quantify, because they did wipe out entire villages, so there's no witnesses, and this is before censuses, especially in like rural Portugal. But these were meant to be allies, these are meant to be friends, and these were definitely innocent people, and these are not the actions of a liberal ruler. When you see that he does not want to give up power, I find that a form of dictatorship. The plebiscites we could probably discuss for hours, but I believe that it was showing a sign of an autocratic, totalitarian system. But tyranny, I think, is fair when you see the legacy of the warfare not being on the front line, and that is something that it will never be excused, in my opinion. And I found it really interesting. Earlier, Luke said he would be happy to be at Waterloo. I would have picked up my brown musket and my cartridge pouch and happily volunteered for the Peninsular War. Though I'm not sure I'm as hard as some of those men, to give them credit on both sides, but it was certainly something that I feel strongly about, to motivate that Napoleon was not a force for good.
Well, before the two of you start taking pot shots at each other, let's have one final kind of interesting slant on this. If you were to switch perspectives for a moment, and I have to say you've both been very nuanced throughout this, and neither of you have adopted the extremes of either position. But if you were to make the cases for the other sides of your respective viewpoints, what would you say about Napoleon? Marcus, you first. What was good about Napoleon?
What was good about Napoleon is he did actually bring stability at the end of the terrors, which followed on from the Ancien regime, which was kind of a bad to worse kind of scenario. So even if he hadn't been successful, it would probably be an improvement. But he brought some initial stability that was really important, and managed to help France recover both socially and economically. And I think it's always been on the rise kind of since then. It's really helped them as a nation. He was fantastic at war. I don't think he was a genius at war. The core system was not something that he invented. It was something that he developed further. I really enjoyed listening to Will Fletcher on the Napoleonicist earlier this month. Went quite deeply into that. But he was excellent at it. And I really don't want to detract away from that. He had some fantastic victories, especially against large numbers. It's always put with the thing of who didn't. You know, there's some other ones out there, but he did some fantastic victories. And his legacy, I mean, the fact we're still talking about him, the propaganda machine that he set up was so successful that we will never stop talking about Napoleon. In fact, I'd imagine in 1,000 years' time, people will still be talking about Napoleon, and they won't be talking about many of our current leaders. He will persist. He will carry on, for good or bad. You know, from the Tombs of Les Invalides to the movie Waterloo to some of his famous quotes, some of his military quotes that are still taught today in places like West Point. and he will continue to be a dominating figure in history. So that is probably going to be his legacy. He will be one of the, if you were going to name 10 people from history, so if at school, someone's going to probably name Napoleon.
And Luke, what's the darker side of Napoleon in your opinion?
I think Napoleon, he changes as a character. I mean, in general over his reign, I think he gets worse and then he gets better again. But if I got to come at it just from the sort of negative aspect, you can see that he can be reckless with human life. He can put his own ambition over the lives of others, and you see this. I think quite early on, even at Jaffa, when he executes thousands of prisoners of war. Which we haven't spoke about quite, which is quite surprising. But I think that's the very darkest side of Napoleon, that he can put his victory and his perception of what he wants and his victory over so many lives. And I think that's a terrible flaw in a person. But then again, there's a flip side, is that ambition can be a good thing as well. But then there's the dark elements of his reign. So you look at the dark elements which underpin the dark legend, but there is of course truth in them. So there's the Jaffa executions, and then there's the execution of the Duke. Even if you can sort of justify that in some way, it's still it's a bad thing in general. He could be arrogant. He could let his own ego get too far. I mean, when we mentioned earlier, he refused what we, I think, would all agree could have been a good chance for a reasonable peace. He could be, he could certainly be cruel, as we said on occasion, and he could let his ambition, his arrogance, and his ego cloud his better judgment. But then again, Napoleon is a huge figure in history, and he's dealing with huge systems and huge ideas, and he's a mover of worlds, isn't he, for want of a better word. So his great positives are sort of balanced out by great negatives as well, in a certain extent. So you can see why there are such polarizing sort of opinions about him, and as Marcus rightly says, this is going to continue. Again, of course, yeah. I didn't mention, in Spain, he misjudged the country completely, and he allowed what he thought to be the sort of the goodness of his ideas to trample over the wants of other peoples, which is somewhat contradictory when you consider his focus on plebiscitary style of democracy. And also his opinions on religion as well, which is something which we haven't mentioned, but something which I find myself sort of torn about. In the one aspect, he has this sort of interesting idea that people deserve to be governed by the religion that is in the majority and that they agree with, which is why he sort of courts Islam in Egypt. But at the same time, there's this sort of reckless sort of utilization of religion as a political tool, which is something which is really unhelpful, and I think is something which we want to steer away from in modern times as much as possible, and edge towards true secularism rather than just cynically using religion, which is, I think, something that he did. So yeah, he's a very complex individual.
Kidnapping the Pope and areas like that. There's so much to cover.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, of course. But I mean, he kidnapped the Pope, but then when he was on St. Helena, the Pope said that he considered Napoleon to be a hero and that he doesn't deserve to suffer on St. Helena, despite the fact that he'd been kidnapped and sort of all this bullying, really, which Napoleon did with the Pope. Yeah.
Gents, this has been absolutely fantastic. It's been an epic odyssey. It went on far longer than I anticipated, but I've enjoyed it hugely. I'm sure the listeners will have enjoyed it hugely. Thank you so much for joining me to discuss Napoleon the Great Debate as part of Napoleon Month. That was manager of Apsley House Marcus Cribb and historian Luke Daly Groves joining me for the Napoleon the Great Debate. You can follow Marcus on Twitter at mcribbhistory, and Luke can be found at Luke Daly Groves. And his excellent book, Hitler's Death, The Case Against Conspiracy, is available from Osprey. As always, the conversation continues online. You can find me on Twitter at zwhitehistory and in the forum at thenapoleonicwars.net. If you're enjoying the episodes, please do take the time to have your say. As Luke and Marcus have shown today, These are complex topics and all views are valued, so please do know that you are always welcome to join the conversation. It's only by having these discussions that we can all develop our understandings of the period. As ever, please do also like, retweet, share, and if you can, take the time to leave a review on your preferred podcast platform. I'll be back on Wednesday as this hectic 2 Napoleonicist episodes a week during lockdown schedule continues. We'll be bringing you the second instalment of our discussions on Napoleon's greatest battle, as Vanya Bellinger, Will Fletcher, Gavin Lewis, and Marcus Cribb, again, will be joining me to discuss Arcole, Jena, Leipzig, and Toulon, which they are respectively championing. Next weekend, I'll be speaking to Professor Beatrice de Graaf on Napoleon and state security, and the following week, I'll be joined by Josh Proven as we go on an epic journey discussing Napoleon's marshals who served in the Peninsular War, which we are affectionately calling Boney's Boys in Spain. Lots more to come then, but until next time, I'm Zach White. This has been Napoleon the Great Debate, part of Napoleon Month here on The Napoleonicist. Take care, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, stay strong, and as always, thank you for listening.
Even when we're on a budget, we still deserve nice things. Quince is a place to scoop up stunning high-end goods for 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They have buttery soft cashmere sweaters starting at $50, luxurious Italian leather bags, and so much more. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get the high-end goods you'll love without the high price tag with Quince. Go to quince.com/style for free shipping and 365-day returns.